Hello. How's everybody doing this Saturday? Today, we're going to talk about Blue Rage Black Redemption, the book about Stanley Tookie Williams. As everybody knows, Tookie Williams, one of the founders of the Crips, who was executed in 2005. I just read his book. Uh, I heard a lot about Tookie Williams. The book was released in 2004. It was finished before he was executed. But clearly, there still feel like there was some missing pieces to it. So we're going to go through the book a little bit, and we're gonna basically not do a book report, but we're kind of going to go through this because there are some things in here that I want to discuss. There's also a lot of ideas in here that I want to discuss, and there's also some regular things I want to discuss, especially since there's recently, and I didn't notice this until literally like an hour and a half ago, there was a gentleman who is on the Joe Rogan Experience. His name is Shaka Sanghor. Okay. I was about to, I was listening to him. I got like, 30 minutes of that. And I was like, wow, I got to get his book too. So I'm going to get his book too. But he seemed to have more clarity about his situation than Tookie Williams seems to have about his. Um, to get right into it, I'm not going to go too deep into it right now. I'm going to let people get in. But I heard a whole lot about Tookie Williams before I read the book. A lot of people saying that he turned his life around and he truly reached a level of redemption, that he wrote an apology for founding the Crips, that and all these sorts of things. And so I had read Monster Cody's book. I actually have it right here too. I went and bought another copy of it. Monster Cody Scott, who of course has passed away now, but he wrote a book in the 90s, I believe, called Monster, uh, the autobiography of LA gang member. And it's so brutal, it's so violent that it kind of tripped off a sort of cottage industry of gangbangers and drug dealers and all these sorts of people writing autobiographies. And Tookie, despite the fact that he was one of the original Crips, he didn't write his book until years after Monster Cody's book had come out. So I had heard a lot about Tookie, and I had read Monster Cody's book already. And I was expecting similar stuff from Tookie, but I walked away with this not really thinking that Tookie was all that redeemed. Um, I know some people are going to say, well, let's just put it like this. I am against the death penalty on principle. I have no real opinion on Tookie's position in terms of, I know a little bit about his case, but I don't know a whole lot. And I haven't studied his case in any real detail. So I can't say that he was railroaded or anything like that. But I can say after reading that book, I'm not certain that Tookie had completely changed his life. Now, why do I say that? Before we get into the book, I want to lay some things out there that are just facts first. It's true that men mellow out the older that they get. It's just true. Okay? Most men do, if they're going to do crime, is usually 16 to 24. I think it is. 16 to 24 usually are prime criminal years. That's when you're most rebellious. You're going through puberty. That's when you have the highest level of testosterone you're going to have. and that's more when you're more likely to do drugs. There's a whole lot of things there. So it's not a surprise that if a man's going to go to jail for the first time, it's usually when he's somewhere between the age of 16 to 24. That's when you're going to get into the most fights and all that sort of stuff. Now, Tookie, when he was arrested, I believe he was 26 or 27 or something like that. So he was right outside of that age bracket. So he was an older guy, getting stuck with some real time. He had a four death sentences. The idea that at Tookie at 50 is more mellow than Tookie at 25, it's like that part is obvious. It's absolutely obvious that he's not going to be the same as he was 25 years prior. So how much credit could we give him for mellowing out, just staying alive long enough to mellow out? That's a question. It's an interesting question that I will put out there. Another little ground rule is prison is indeed punishment. That's part of what we want people in prison for. And if he changed his ways through the punishment, then that proves that the punishment worked. And whenever people say that they went to prison and they were reformed, it just proves that prison works. So, and it's not a surprise to me that almost all of these guys go to prison and they come out with African names. We'll talk about that later. Okay. But another thing that I want to set up here before we get into the book actually is it's highly unfortunate, very, very unfortunate, that for a lot of black males, the very first time they read a book is when they go to prison. The very first time they see a dentist is when they go to prison. The very first time they meet a psychiatrist is because they went to prison. The very first time they meet friends that might actually care about them is in prison. So prison becomes, for a lot of people, sometimes it's the first time they was actually introduced to religion as well, whether it's Christianity or Islam or whatever, is in prison. Now you may ask yourself, what are these people doing all day if they've never read anything? They're not going to the doctor. They're not going to the dentist. They're not living like normal people. What are they doing all day? And I think that this book answers that question. They're bullshitting all day, What I expected from this book was that we would get some accountability from Tookie. And we got a little bit, but we got a whole lot of blaming the system, blaming racism, Uncle Tom's, snitches, all this sort of stuff. Everybody's a liar. The only thing he really took accountability for, there was, two main things he took accountability for. One of them was using drugs. The second was found in the Crips. And I guess if you could say one more thing is being violent. That just kind of goes with found in the Crips. Okay. His history of violence. He, of course, continuously denied that he was involved with any of the murders. He did not apologize for any of the murders because he said he did not commit the murders. So he was even executed, as far as I know, still claiming that he was innocent of the homicides. All right, so let's get into the book. The book can be broken down into essentially stand verses. The book is very aggressive with a lot of the things that Tookie doesn't like. Tookie had issues with his mom. That's kind of like the first couple of chapters is Tookie versus, being uprooted from Louisiana where he was born and taken to Los Angeles by his mom. and finding out he had a sister. Then he hated his sister for no apparent reason. Then he, of course, hates LA. LA is full of gangs. LA is, the longer he's there, the more he's not comfortable being there. He hates order in general. So he's constantly stealing. He's constantly fighting. He's antisocial as hell, even as a child. He hates school. He hated his teachers. His mom gets a boyfriend. He hates his step siblings. He hates psychiatry because his mom asked him to go see a psychiatrist. He hates psychiatry. So it's hard to even see in the first couple of chapters what he liked, but it set the stage because the book is split into two parts, one called Blue Rage, the other called Black Redemption. And the Blue Rage part is all of the stuff I just read out to you. His deep discomfort with so many of these things. But there is no source to any of this. And in reading this part of his life story, which is actually the most interesting part, you see that he was given plenty of opportunities, but he also just screwed it up again and again. For instance, he was kicked out of pretty much every high school in Los Angeles, usually for fighting. Okay? This means he got opportunities again and again and again and again and again. He kept getting kicked out. They sent him to Job Corps in Utah. He got kicked out of there for fighting. Okay? He got a job as a counselor where he really just was kind of like a youth counselor, a job he was not qualified for. And he pretty much fucked the job off because he was a Crip at the time, and he was crippin', as he says it, CRPPEN, crippin'. All right? He missed out on so many opportunities, but the book is littered with how he had nothing. No one was looking out for him. But you see all of these opportunities where he was taken from one school to another, a whole new opportunity. And he just get into fights. He'd run away from school, do all these sorts of things. And chapter 6, I wish I would have wrote down the page number here. But I do actually have notes. I don't know what page it's on. I will be able to find it eventually, but it's an interesting sentence that I want to read. Okay, where is? I'm looking for the direct quote that I want to quote here. So chapter 6 is where his mom sends him to the psychiatrist. Now his mom sends him to a psychiatrist because, of course, he's a antisocial kid, you know. So here's part of it. Though my mother was the parent, I established early that no amount of biblical beatings could deflect my doing what I wanted to do. I was willing to suffer the consequences at my mother's hands. Through our lack of communication, sorry, the book closed. My mother believed something was wrong with me mentally. I was then treated as being handicapped, impaired, or simply no good. She did not expect me to live past the age of 17, 18, or 21, but she insisted that I receive some kind of outside help. A psychiatrist was found to treat me. Now, he doesn't like the psychiatrist because the psychiatrist is white. And that's the excuse he uses for not going to the psychiatrist and not, buying into psychiatry. The psychiatrist is white and doesn't really understand him. He says, quote, The color barrier between the white shrink and me wasn't the only problem. He could have been black, brown, yellow, or red. I would have been equally unsuccessful. The problem, I now believe, was the absence of a valid psychoanalytic model designed to address Black people, the Black experience. What is he talking about? All right. Now, there is no universal Black experience. Okay. There might be experience in this particular environment, because I know Los Angeles has very unique circumstances in terms of it being the gang capital of planet Earth. But it's not like he even attempted to participate in this whole thing anyway. So again, it didn't work because there's no psychoanalytic model for the Black experience, which I'm pretty sure works on some people, but it doesn't work on me, because I know there's no such thing as a universal Black experience. So chapter 7, he meets his stepfather for the first time, a man named Fred Hollywell, who meets his mom at a laundromat, which he says happened because this is the one time his mom went to the laundromat without him. He talked about running off all of her other boyfriends, which makes sense because that happens a lot in the Black community. A lot of sons run off the boyfriends of their moms. They run off stepdads if they can. Been there, done that. I even did that myself, so I can't blame him for that. I can't blame him for that. I've been there. But he talks about being called proper and saying that his step family thought he was acting white. So I don't know what that means. Nobody knows what that means. I'm looking for the quote that says, "My disruptive behavior were only a show of independence," and claims that he was asserting himself as a man, which is caused his rift with his mother. So he claimed he was just being independent. That's why he was going out getting into fights and causing all sorts of chaos and trouble. He was just being independent, guys. I was asserting myself as a man. Very bizarre. So, and then of course, he talks about Fred being a threat to this. As he talks about, he says, "The first time Fred showed up at our house, I recoiled in defiance and refused to communicate. His cordial efforts to put me at ease fed my indifference. My mind raced with dreadful thoughts of being replaced by a dominant male. It was a devastating blow to my boyhood seeking manhood, and my world came crumbling down. Fred was the first man ever to enter our home as my mother's love interest and my potential rival. As it stood, I was being dethroned by a stranger. I was furious." Interesting insight here, because it goes together with his previous comment about wanting to be independent and wanting to assert himself as the man of the house. And part of that was being disrespectful to his mother. Part of that was being disrespectful to the teachers. Part of that was getting into fights. Now, he does recognize in this book that his misguided beliefs in manhood stem a lot from him not having a male role model during the early part of his life. However, we know that Fred was there and he rebuked Fred. He refused to accept Fred into his life, even though he did later on. When Fred passed away, he expressed a great deal of sadness. And I think Fred died in 1988. And Tookie was very upset about this. So that was another thing that I was very much interested in, is that the early part of the book, a lot of it was Tookie refusing to adapt. Something would change and he would refuse to change with it. You know, his mom wanted him to do certain things, he would basically refuse. You know, his mom he had a sister, a little sister. Well, I don't know if it's little sister or big sister. I can't remember. But when she came from Louisiana to LA, he was furious about this. You know, he was really upset by it and even bullied her. He couldn't adapt to the idea of having a sister. He couldn't adapt to the change to Los Angeles. He couldn't adapt to each school that he went to. He couldn't adapt to the idea of having step siblings. Constantly, again and again, he finds himself in new situations and him unable to fit in, unable to adapt to his surroundings and his circumstances. So, what does that create in you when you have nothing to get attached to? Well, then you do the old trope of the found family. He talks about in 1971, he meets Raymond Washington, who has started the East Side Cribs. Now, there's obviously some issues with who actually founded the Crips. Most people think Raymond Washington, who was killed in 1979. He was killed in August of 1979. Tookie was arrested in March of 1979. So both of these guys were taken off the board pretty quickly. There's a lot of questions about who actually founded the Crips. There's guys doing Vlad TV interviews saying Tookie was never a founder of the Crips. He joined later. There's other people who claim to have been founders of the Crips. They even wrote books claiming to be founders of the Crips. This is all up in the air because Raymond Washington, again, was killed in 1979, and he's the only person we know for sure was one of the people who founded the Crips. Now, who else was there? We don't know. We could have to ask, unless you got a Ouija board, you can't ask Raymond Washington, okay? Everybody who's still alive has a different version of the story. Tookie said he was there. Raymond Washington did have a crew when he met him, and Tookie had a crew. So it was basically Raymond Washington had his crew on the east side, and Tookie had his crew on the west side. And they decided to, because they were overwhelmed by gangs, these smaller gangs, but there was a lot of them, they decided to form a super gang. And of course, from this comes the Cribs, which would later be known as the Crips. They said the Cribs was the original name of the group, and then it was often mispronounced as Crip. They say a lot of the things that comes accompanied with the Crips, it comes from both sides. One of them was the Cuz thing, which they say comes from the west side, but Raymond and all those guys had already adopted some of the other elements of Cripdom. And they say like the blue do-rags, the blue bandanas came from actually one of the Crips who was murdered. They took up the blue rags in his honor. I'm trying to figure out what his name was. Okay, so here it is. It says, when Raymond and I became joint leaders of the Cribs, we functioned as a single federation. But during that period when our name, the Cribs, mutated into the Crips, tribalism began to develop. The two organizations were autonomous and were allies with the same agenda, war against street gangs. Each side engaged in a competitive aggression to see which could conquer the most gangs or take the most leather coats, cars, jewelry, or money from those gangs. In spite of all the inflated egos, there was no tribal Crip warfare between the East and West, not even fistfights. The occasional verbal conflicts between homeboys was always settled in full contact football games held on Saturdays at St. Andrews Park. It was a magnificent scene, a collection of black talent on the field, although none of them will ever be offered an athletic scholarship or even an education. Now, this is an interesting bit because they told you, well, Tookie tells you in this passage what the Crips were all about. They were about attacking and robbing other gang members. And of course, Tookie goes through this whole thing telling you how they recruited other people by basically squabbling up with them. They will walk up to a guy, Crip or what? What are you going to do? You going to be down with us, or are we going to have to kick your ass? What's this? And then they would go around robbing coats, taking jewelry, just generally being thugs. And he talks about them mostly fighting, not using guns too much, but they did carry guns because oftentimes they were shot at. And that was one of the issues about escalating the violence. Now that they were a bigger gang, they could jump smaller gangs and jump people at parties. They've done a lot of that, a lot of jumping people at parties. And people would defend themselves by shooting at them. So that led to the Crips having to pick up guns. And he talks about all of the different Crip sets and some of them forming over time. And I'm trying to look and see which one of these guys was the one that was carrying the blue bandana first, because that's the interesting. That's one of the more interesting bits. Okay, so we could just talk about this. All right, so he says, quote, this is from page 100. The Crips was a vehicle to provide us with illusory empowerment, payback, camaraderie, protection, thuggery, and a host of other benefits. We wanted to be exempt from being disenfranchised, diseducated, disempowered, and destitute. But opportunities for us were scarce. We were 17-year-olds with minds polluted by misconceptions, and we wanted to be emancipated from the struggle against the conditions seeking our extinction or emasculation. But regardless of the hostile opposition or lack of social privilege, my vested interest, like everyone else's, was simply to survive. The Crips became central to my self-destructive resolve. And then this is where they start talking about cripping. He defines like what cripping means. What does it mean to crip? I'm not going to go into that. It's irrelevant. But it says a lot here because, again, as we discussed, the only way for you to not be able to take accountability for yourself is he uses the term diseducation. Now, I am 100% in favor of the idea that public schools are bullshit. All right? I 100% support that idea. The issue is this guy was taken to every school in the city, and he kept quitting and refusing to go. He didn't get diseducated. He didn't get educated at all. He didn't go to school. And he still got plenty of other opportunities. He was still made like a youth counselor or something like that. He got sent outside of the state. He got sent to Utah for Job Corps, and he still managed to get into a fight. It's insanity. Of course, he starts talking about wanting to be king of the Crips. This is something that he's always wanted. He says, bonded by our commonality, low economic status, the Crips became my family. I placed Crip above and beyond all else, even my life. Survival in this community meant slim pickings for a black youth such as myself, but as a Crip, I could strive to be legendary. It was my intent to make Crip and Tookie synonymous, a matched set and a terrorizing force among every other black gang in South Central. My lack of anonymity and my obsession to be recognized enabled the school administration to identify me as the West Side Crips leader and expel me. It was a blow to my ego to be thrown out of school I was supposed to reign over. That's the only reason he wanted to be in school, is he wanted to be famous. He wanted to be liked or feared or maybe even respected. He wasn't in school to actually learn anything. So how are you diseducated, but you wasn't in fucking school to learn? At this point, Tookie has not read any books. He's not done anything. You know, he's just out cripping, as he says. He ain't doing nothing but cripping, which is basically robbing other gangbangers, starting fights and such. All right. These are really, really bad times for the Crips. But this is the rise of the gang. He talks about a lot of the drugs that they were doing, smoking sherm, love leaf, huff and glue. A lot of the really insane things that these guys were doing. And it's kind of scary, kind of. It's to be expected, but it was deeply problematic. So I'm trying to find where they got the blue do-rags from. I still haven't seen it. He writes extensively about Curtis Moreau, nicknamed Buddha, who is he the one that was wearing the blue do-rag? Yeah, here it is. He says, so Buddha was murdered. And he says, I had always seen beyond his toughness and identified with his hidden humanity. He was the most unique person I had ever known. We discovered while attending Banning High School that Buddha was a whiz with numbers, a potential mathematical genius. Buddha was also the first of us Crips to style a blue bandana. Although there have been numerous false accounts written about the origin of the blue bandana association with the Crips, it initially became part of Buddha's color-coordinated ensemble of blue Levi's, blue shirt, and dark blue suspenders. Oftentimes, Buddha's blue bandana hung loosely outside of his left pants pocket or wrapped around his head, pirate style, and used to wipe his brow. Later, we would wear the blue bandana in memoriam of Buddha's demise. That tribute to him eventually morphed into the allegoric color of blue for the Crips. So I kind of figured that. I should have wrote that down, but I didn't know that. Apparently, Buddha was murdered because that's how these things end. You either go to prison or you get murdered. They're learning this, which they should have known by now because gangs existed before the Crips. Now, let's move forward. I don't want to talk too much more about the Crips. So, he was arrested in 1979 on 4 homicide charges. In the book, he takes no responsibility for these 4 homicides. He claims he didn't do any of them. And essentially, he'd been spending most of 1977 and 1979 doing drugs. And drugs became an integral part of Tookie's life. So from page 186, he talks about smoking sherm. He says, smoking sherm, a person's behavior can range from a zombie to streaking naked, and moving in slow motion, being hyped up or immune to pain, amnesiac or being violent with enormous physical strength. And then he talks about, he says sherm was cheap, and if it was from a strong batch, a few puffs could keep you high for hours. It enhanced my mood swings, making me far less tolerable of petty things I normally let slip by. At the height of my aggression, I developed a terrible habit of jap slapping. Now, put a pin in that. Spitting in somebody's face or provoking a fight. I even launched into a debasing monologue about a guy's mother, and if that failed, I simply knock him out. As for women, I was never hostile towards them. They were always on the agenda. No matter how high I flew, I didn't let it interfere with my womanizing. I was fascinated with a woman's rear end, resembling as it does two volleyballs tucked under tight skin. Most Crips I knew felt the same. It's not the beauty, it's the booty. So it's interesting that he said he developed a terrible habit of jap slapping. 3 of the victims who were murdered, and he was convicted of these murders even though he said he didn't do it, were Asians. 3 of the victims of the homicides that he said he didn't do, and he developed a nasty habit of jap slapping, but he didn't murder these 3 Asians. Interesting. This is what I mean, though. He's taking accountability for certain things, but not, the crimes that he was actually convicted of. And that's a good thing. You got to give him credit for this. He's actually holding up to not being a good father, which I was very interested in. But he talked about being arrested all these times. He was arrested so many times in this book. He was countlessly arrested again and again. And he would beat the case. He would get caught with a gun. He'd assault somebody. He'd assault a police officer or whatever. And he finally get away with it. He get away with it for lack of evidence or something like that. But again, you're told over and over again, the system is racist and the system is out to get him. He not at one point in time considers that cripping is why he ended up in prison for the rest of his life. Now, let's talk about some of this stuff here. So that the hotel murders took place in March of 1979. These were the 3 Asians that were killed. None of that is mentioned in this chapter. Okay? He didn't even try to come up with where he was when this stuff happened. He just talks about lifting weights, which he does a whole lot. He's a competitive bodybuilder. And hanging out. And of course, he was doing drugs. He doesn't even say that he was at I believe it was a hotel where they were murdered. He claims that somebody was abused, beat up, forced to snitch on him, and that's why he got arrested. So, again, no accountability whatsoever for this. Now, one of the reasons why he ended up getting convicted is this pair, known as the Garretts. They are the people, 2 of the people who testified against him. Now, Tookie was living with the Garretts, and because he had been put out of his mom's house, so he had got put out of other kind of apartments that he had to. Again, just perpetually fucking up, but of course, it's the environment is racism and all that shit, right? So he says, quote, this is from page 204. The Garretts told me I had access to their garage anytime, or if need be, their home was open to me. They were seemingly friendly people willing to help. None of us suspected they were agent provocateurs, snitches. Plus, I didn't know the Garretts had informed on Juice and Hillbilly. Being smoked out, I had long since lost my edge to detect a snitch when no one else could. The Garretts managed to snake their way around without exposure while plotting nefarious schemes with anyone seeking to make a buck. Then later, they would turn this unsuspecting friend into the cops. This is what he claims happened to him. This was his excuse because when I when I read this, I went to the case file. I said, okay, he's not talking at all about this homicide. He's avoiding the shit out of this homicide, right? But he just denigrated the Garretts. Now, why would he want to do that? Well, because the Garretts were two of the prime witnesses against him. Now, I'm going to Stanford University. So we're taking it out of the book for a little bit. In 1988, he tried to appeal his sentence. Okay. And he appealed it up to the Supreme Court. And they, of course, denied his appeal. But here is the 7-Eleven murder. This took place in February of 1979. It says, quote, Alvin Owens was an employee at a 7-Eleven store in Whittier. Alfred Coward, known as Blackie, testified as an immunized witness and gave the following account of Owens' death. At approximately 10:30 p.m. on February 27, 1979, defendant, that would be Tookie, came to Coward's house. The two went up to the homes of James Garrett, where the defendant was staying, and defendant went inside, returning with a sawed-off shotgun. He was accompanied by a man named Daryl, who was wearing a brown corduroy jacket. The three men made several stops, including one to obtain Sherms, which are cigarettes containing PCP. They all shared a Sherm cigarette, then picked up Tony Sims, who was dressed in a green jogging suit and a cap. Defendant shared a second Sherm with Coward and Sims, and asked Sims if he knew where they could make money in Pomona. Taking two cars to foursome, made two unsuccessful restaurant and liquor store robbery attempts, and eventually went to a 7-Eleven store where Owens, the victim, was sweeping the parking lot. Sims and Darrow went into the store, followed by Owens, defendant, and Coward. Coward testified he saw no one with a weapon except Tookie, the defendant, who approached Owens and told him to keep walking. Owens walked toward the back rooms of the store with the defendant and Coward following him. Defendant told Owens to lay down, and Owens complied. Coward heard a gun being loaded, heard a shot and glass breaking, followed by two more shots. The group then returned to Sims' house where the money was divided. Sims asked why defendant had shot Owens, and defendant explained he did not want to leave any witnesses. He also said the shotgun shells could not be traced and that he had retrieved a few of them. Coward saw defendant later that morning at the home of the defendant's brother. So Tookie has a stepbrother. He stated defendant told his brother, "You should have heard the way he sounded when I shot him." Defendant then made a growling noise and laughed hysterically for a number of minutes. Now, Blackie, of course, snitched. Blackie is in his book a couple of times. I don't want to go through and try to find them specifically. But the hotel murders, the three Asians who were killed in March of 1979, he ended up getting convicted on these because of the Garretts. Okay? Again, you would think this guy who has sat through all these trials would try to nitpick the case at the very least. He gives you almost nothing on those cases. Virtually nothing. So going back to the trial rundown, the Brookhaven Motel murders is in March of 1979. Robert Yang and his family owned and lived in Brookhaven Motel on South Vermont Street in Los Angeles. About 5 a.m. on March 11, 1979, he heard a woman screams and 3 or 4 shots. A few minutes later, he left his bedroom and saw the door separating the motel office from the living quarters was open. It appeared the door had been forced open from the outside. He discovered his father, mother, and sister had all been fatally wounded by shotgun fire. The cash drawer was open and empty. The police found 2 shotgun shells at the scene. A firearms expert testified that the shells could have only come from a weapon identified has been purchased by Tookie in 1974. Now, he mentions having a shotgun in this book several times. he mentions going to keeping the shotgun at other people's houses. Okay. Let me see if I can find very quickly a place where he mentions having the shotgun. Because it's very suspicious that he would basically admit in this book that he had a shotgun, but then say, "Oh no, 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 no! I didn't do any of the murdering. I didn't have nothing to do with no murders." Now, so he mentions in this book loaning his shotgun to a guy named James. Well, I'm guessing is James Garrett. All right. So back to the testimony. It says 3 witnesses provided testimony regarding defendants' involvement in the Brookhaven incident. James Samuel Coleman testifying as an immunized witness. This is the guy that Tookie in his book says was pounded by the sheriffs and police until he snitched on Tookie. This is what he put in his book, that Samuel Coleman was abused again and again, beaten within an inch of his life. Matter of fact, let's go through that right now. Okay. He said, so Tookie, Samuel, and Jackie went to the pool hall, and he had retrieved his shotgun from the Garrett's house. Of course, this is very suspicious that he ended up having a shotgun, right? So then he says, we drove down Central Boulevard on our way to see Bob Simmons, but we never made it. We were pulled over by 2 sheriff cars from Firestone. The bullhorn blared, warning us to exit the car with arms raised above our heads. 4 sheriffs, guns drawn, approached us cautiously. After they searched us, we were handcuffed and ordered to sit on the curb. 2 sheriffs guarded us while the other 2 started tearing apart Samuel's car. Again, this is Samuel Coleman. 2 sheriffs guarded us while the other 2 started tearing apart Samuel's car. Within minutes, at least 5 more Firestone patrol cars appeared. There were so many white sheriffs around, it looked like a Ku Klux Klan meeting. The air stank of racial slurs and hate. During the race-based insults by the sheriffs, Samuel fell out in the street on his back, behaving as if he was having a heart attack, asking the sheriff to contact his wife to bring him his medication. Samuel's health problems was news to me. Nick, shut up, one of the sheriffs said. But Samuel persisted in his plea for medication until the sheriff pointed a gun at him, fingered on the trigger, threatening to blow his head off. That's when Samuel, with the agility of a gymnast, jumped and landed upright on the curb. His antics caused the sheriffs to laugh for several minutes. You believe that coon could move that fast? One of the sheriffs once said one sheriff between gales of laughter. The merriment of the sheriffs quickly vanished when the announcement that a double-barrel shotgun had been found in the trunk of Samuel's car. Samuel produced a license for the weapon, but the sheriffs refused to accept it as valid. As we were being pushed into the backseat of the patrol car, I heard a voice say, I know who the big dude is. That's Tookie. As if on cue, every sheriff said, who? And the guy said, you know Tookie, the big Crip leader everybody talks about. I then became a specimen for all of them to gawk at. Are you really Tookie? How big are your arms? Can you really bitch press over 500 pounds? Are you still leader of the West Side Crips? The queries continued as if I were being mobbed by reporters. But I refused to answer. Samuel made an absurd statement, which I ignored, about preparing to jump through the closed window of the police car to escape. Arriving at the Firestone Sheriff Station, Samuel became more eccentric. He paced back and forth in the holding tank with tears streaming down his face, mumbling over and over that his wife needed him. After our one phone call, I was escorted from the holding tank into a cell with a steel door. Several minutes later, Samuel was brought to the door. Bracing himself in the doorway, he refused to come in. He yelled out, I don't want to be locked up. I want to go home. 2 sheriffs tried to push him inside the cell, but he wouldn't budge. Finally, one sheriff snatched Samuel by the collar and pulled him backward from the doorway. The other sheriff slammed the door shut. I could hear Samuel screaming like a woman in labor and the sheriffs hollering, stupid nigger. I could also hear the sickening sounds of a stick hitting flesh. After a few hours passed, Samuel began to cry and scream. Let me out of here. Please let me out of here. I called out to him numerous times, but he never responded. After a while, Samuel quieted down, but still refused to answer when I called out his name. This was the first time I had ever seen a black man react so strangely in jail. I didn't know that Samuel had never been arrested. I had never known a black man about my age who had not spent time in jail, whether guilty or not. Before the night ended, I heard someone yelling at Samuel, didn't the nigga do it? Didn't he murder those people? Or was it you, nigga? Samuel again started to cry. His wails were punctuated by denials that he knew nothing and had nothing to do with the murder case. After being beaten again, though, his story dramatically changed. Yes, 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 he did it. I heard Samuel scream, he did it. I'll say whatever you want, please, just don't beat me anymore. He says, I had no idea who he was. Later, legal documents would show that Samuel's ribs were fractured that March night over 2 decades ago, that he was beaten unconscious by the sheriffs, left lying on the cell floor in a pool of his own blood. I did not see Samuel again for 2 years until the day he took the witness stand to testify under oath, untruthfully, that I killed 3 people, though I was ultimately charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of robbery using a firearm. So he went through a great amount of detail to portray Samuel Coleman as a victim of abuse by the sheriffs and a coward who had never spent any time in prison. Now, that sounds like something you would do if you were being very defensive, okay? Now, so far, like I said, the Garretts were witnesses against him. He referred to them as snitches and saying that they were involved in all these crimes and then they would just turn people in. And now he's saying basically Samuel was abused and forced into it. But let's get back to what Samuel actually said on the stand. Samuel Coleman testified as an immunized witness, said that on March 10th, he and Tookie, the defendant, went to the Showcase bar where he remained until it closed around 6 a.m. He last remembered seeing defendant about 2:30 a.m. But the next day, defendant told him he had robbed and killed some people on Vermont Street. Defendant said he got approximately $50 and was going to use it to buy some PCP. James Garrett testified that defendant kept some of his possessions at the Garrett house and stayed there for approximately 5 days a week. Early in the morning of March 13, 1979, defendant told Garrett and his wife that he had heard that some Chinese people had been killed on Vermont Street. He said he did not know how the killings had occurred, but thought the killers were professionals because no shells or witnesses had been left. He went on to say that he heard the killings had occurred about 5 o'clock in the morning, that 2 men had knocked down the door, and that the men had taken $600. Later, the defendant again spoke about how the people were killed. After the big guy knocked the door down, he went into the motel, and there was a guy laying on the couch, and he blew him away. Defendant said that the man on the couch and a woman at the cash register were shot twice, and another woman was also shot. Garrett testified defendant told him he was the big guy. Esther Garrett, who is James Garrett's wife, testified to essentially the same matters as her husband. In addition to the omissions testified by Mr. Garrett, Esther Garrett said defendant told them the killers were using the money to buy juice, aka PCP, and that the killers had picked up the bullets, but there would be no evidence for the police. After her husband left, defendant told Ms. Garrett he had committed the murder with his brother-in-law. Interesting. Now, Tookie had never been married, by the way. So this is probably just some guy he's hanging out with. George Ogleby, gunner, who was, I think, a gangbanger. Ogleby was an inmate who was housed in the same cell block as Tookie. A few cells away, Ogleby testified in late April. The defendant asked him about the chances of escaping from Atascadero or Patton, where he might be sent. He later asked Ogleby if he wished to be included in an escape plan. Now, Tookie, of course, denied that all of this occurred. In the book, he continued to deny that there was any escape attempt and that Gunner was a jailhouse snitch and that he couldn't be trusted. So that was that. That was essentially why Tookie was found guilty. Several witnesses claimed that he was high on PCP and told them that he was doing drugs and that he had committed these robberies. So let's go to page 225 in the book. So Tookie claims that he was drugged against his will in jail, which if his brain was fried from PCP, they was probably trying to detox him in some way. I don't know that much about PCP, to be quite honest. But he talked about being shackled at the jails, which of course was obvious. His stepfather had actually showed up, which was very nice of him. What page am I looking for here? I lost what page I'm on. Okay, 225. He said, when the judge read aloud from his record of my presumed sins, a gasp went up from the spectators as he detailed the allegations. Multiple robberies and the shotgun murders of 4 people, 3 Asians and 1 Caucasian. The Caucasian would be the guy at the 7-Eleven, okay? Vaguely, I recall the judge's grimace, which caused me to reciprocate whenever we locked eyes. Neither of us hiding our mutual disdain. I wanted desperately to holler out disparaging insults at this white figure who sat on a pedestal as if he was better than me. But the nexus between my mind and voice had been severed. I possessed no defensive or offensive capabilities. All I could do was sit there and listen. He claimed he was drugged throughout this entire time. Okay. But it was very important to note that he talked about the judge being white. Again, he takes no responsibility for anything. Okay. The only thing he said was, well, I was in a gang and I took drugs and I got into fights all the time. Just no responsibility is always, you got to slip in that the judge was white, or later on he's talking about trying to get out of prison and he had to go to this panel. Then you have to talk about what color the people on the panel are, because if you tell the people what color they are, then obviously they will be against you, right? Or for you. He said, prior to my abduction from South Central, I had spent purposeless years under the influence of drugs such as PCP and LSD. I will never forget the weird trips I experienced, nor the violent aggression I initiated because of my personal drug use. Nevertheless, the psychopharmacology employed against me in high power, that would be the jail, proved far more devastating. It was like being buried alive. I felt my brain suffocating. Felt as if though I was falling through deep space into nothingness. This was nothing like getting high off street drugs. The medicinal unit's medication was a mind killer. So this is why he is explaining why he couldn't defend himself from all of these accusations against him. So that is essentially the Blue Rage portion of the book. The Blue Rage portion ends with him being found guilty of 4 homicides, one of the in February and the other in March of 1979. So he details his time in prison, of course. I'm not going to go through all of that because it's a lot of that prison stuff is kind of boring. He just talks about, a lot of the people that he met in prison, getting, letters from people. I have no idea how he was meeting women in prison, like women that didn't know him and all that sort of stuff, just showing up at the prison. I'm going to get to some part that I actually liked in a second, but I'm trying to get through the book. Now, he talks in night. So he meets this woman by the name of Barbara Becknell. Now, Barbara Becknell is an important piece of this story because she wrote the epilogue of this book. And the epilogue of this book details Tookie's execution. Okay. So she basically finishes the book off by telling us what happened to Tookie after he wrote his last pages, which of course was that he was executed in 2005. Okay. So she is an important piece of the story. He calls her the human angel because she starts bringing in a lot of attention towards Tookie. She's the one who helped him get book deals. She's the one who helped the movie come out. You've probably seen the movie with Jamie Foxx. It's not a very good movie. And then all of a sudden, he starts getting celebrities coming to the prison to see him. Jamie Foxx came to the prison to meet him, to study him for the movie. He gets a visit from Winnie Mandela, South African communist. And she is putting effort in to get him moved to a safer area called A Block, right? So she wants him to move to A Block. It's a prison thing where, you know, there's higher acuities in the prison, and he was one of the higher acuity ones, and she was trying to get him moved to a lower security one. Anyway, one of the things they wanted him to do in order to get moved to a lower security place was to debrief. Okay. Now, this is interesting. I'm going to read this right out of the book. So, apparently, Tookie was being a good boy in jail at this point in time. Now, just in jail, in prison, he was getting into fights. He talked about that a lot, you know, slapping people, getting into fights and stuff. And then he's been a good boy. So he says, at the committee meeting, Hammond, who he called an Uncle Tom earlier in the book, reminded the members that I had not had any disciplinary write-ups in years. And so he was therefore recommending me for grade A status. Nelson, the associate warden, vehemently objected, as did others. One of them said, the man's the co-founder of the Crips, for Christ's sake. His influence is too vast. He doesn't deserve a status change. Then another counselor proposed that I should debrief. Hammond explained that debriefing was for prison gang members, not a street gang like the Crips. Another counselor said, well, since Mr. Williams wants grade A, which is, you know, more privileges and more space and all that sort of stuff, he should debrief anyway. Hammond said, I'm almost confident Mr. Williams would refuse to debrief or to submit to a polygraph test. Then he looked at me. Through clenched teeth, I said, of course I refuse to debrief. I value my life and dignity too much to debrief. I left the room, steaming. Okay? So it says debriefing is a system used throughout the California Department of Corrections to barter the souls of prison gang members, revolutionists, or any prisoner for information about their gang, its members, their hegemony, and past and present criminal activities. Crips passing through the hole used to talk about how homeboys and other individuals in prison gangs who had debriefed like it was the thing to do. Rumor had it the only way the man to get out of the hole at Pelican Bay, a maximum security prison in California near the Oregon state border, was by being paroled, debriefing, or in a casket. During a visit, I explained to Barbara what debriefing meant. Offended by their suggestion that I should debrief, she said her next step would be to contact Hammond. Now, this is very important because this comes up in a 60 Minutes interview that I saw when one of the gentlemen, they were debating whether Tookie should be executed and all this sort of stuff and whether his redemption is real. And the guy said, well, Tookie didn't debrief. He was given the opportunity to debrief and he refused. Now, I could see it from both sides. Okay? From the side of the people who want him to debrief, they're saying, if you really have renounced being a Crip, then you would help us destroy the Crips. So why do you care? Why do you care about the Crips if you're not a Crip anymore? Right? Perfectly logical thing to argue. Now, a lot of people don't know this, and it's something similar, but there are plenty of people out there in the Christian community, especially in the Black Christian community, that they go after the Black Greek letter organizations. What they'll do is they'll find somebody who has been in, an Alpha or a Kappa or whatever, and they would debrief them. Now, for those of you who don't know, when you are a Christian and you give your soul to the Lord, one of the things you have to do is you have to not take any oaths. Since Black Greek letter organizations require you to take an oath, the pastors, in order to sort of redeem you from having done that, having taken that oath, you have to rescind being in the organizations, any false idols that you worshiped while you were there, and you have to be debriefed, meaning you have to give up the secrets of the organization in order for people to really believe that you're no longer a member of the organization. There are G. Craig Lewis actually does debriefings, like there's some up on his channel or whatever, where he sits down with like Sigmas or people from Omega Psi Phi or whatever, and they talk about the inner workings of the organization. They talk about the secret handshake. They talk about all that stuff. Okay. Because they said, well, I was a young man when I took this oath, and they had us worshiping false gods and engaging in all kind of unchristian behavior. And in order to not just say, I'm no longer going to be a part of that, I'm going to actively try to destroy it, I'm going to share their secrets. This is what they're asking Tookie to do. Now, this is to him offensive, but I'm going to give you another example. There's a guy by the name of Joe Valachi. He was the very first man to ever snitch in the mafia, and he gave it all up. He was completely debriefed. The FBI didn't know that much about the mob until the Joe Valachi papers. That's how they figure out what the bosses were, who the consiglieres were, how the organization operated, how you can be initiated, the whole 9 yards. He gave it all up. And everybody who snitched since then has done essentially the same thing. They've given up the organizations. They've given up the secret of the organizations, because to be in the mob, you have to take an oath. Okay? So one of the things that is very, very important when you're in an organization, especially a criminal enterprise or some organization that requires for you to take an oath, is that for people to really believe that you have rescinded being a member of that organization, that you would break that oath. Okay? So this is what they want Tookie to do. In order to prove to them that you have been, rescinding the life of being a Crip, why can't you break the oath of not snitching in the street? Okay? Now, obviously, Barbara and Tookie, because Barbara is, his representative in these situations, they argue that if Tookie was to snitch, his life is in danger. If he was to debrief about the Crips, his life would be in danger. He would be shanked and killed in prison. Okay? He already had 4 life sentences. He was not getting out. Usually people are willing to snitch if there's some light at the end of the rainbow. He wasn't getting out. They weren't even going to offer him to get out. So it wasn't worth it for him to give up anything. Now, in interviews, he would claim he had nothing to give, that he was so far away from the organization that it didn't operate the same way as when he was arrested in the first place. Again, he was arrested in 1979. All of this stuff is happening in the 90s. All right. This is after Monster Cody's book had come out. So he had already written about the Crips and all that sort of stuff already. Okay, because he didn't meet Barbara Becknell until 1993, and Monster came out in 1994, and she was already investigating and doing a book on gangs in L.A. And she went to talk to Tookie because he was still alive, and that's how they met and all that sort of stuff. So this becomes a very important thing later as they're trying to save his life. People are saying, okay, he wrote all these children's books, but he wouldn't give them up. He wouldn't debrief. He wouldn't snitch. They don't use the word snitch. They use the word debrief. He wouldn't debrief. Now, the silly thing about this is they're trying to play word games. They're saying, well, the Crips are a street gang. They're not a prison gang. They don't stop cripping when they go to prison. So the Crips are a prison gang too, okay? You just click up in prison. What are you talking about? But I completely understand why he didn't tell anything. There was no light at the end of the tunnel for him. Joe Valachi got immunity when he did that. When Sammy the Bull Gravano, when he snitched, he got out early. You know, they weren't going to let Tookie out, so he just decided to take that to the grave. And besides, the only person that he probably could have snitched on were people who were probably already dead or in prison anyway. So he had nothing really to tell. But this is a very important bit, because when it comes to outsiders believing whether Tookie was really seeking redemption, one of the things they wanted to hear is an apology for the murders, which he refused to apologize for because he continuously said he didn't do them, and for him to snitch on the Crips, what he didn't do. So the two most important things that people would ask him to do, he refused to do. Now, that should make a person be more interested. He still refused even in his 50s. He was executed at 51, so he wasn't like in his 50s long. So that was interesting. And when I say I really question the whole redemption thing, that's one of the reasons why. Because he started to speak out against gangs. But a lot of that, I guess now is the time. We've been talking about this for an hour. I guess it's now time for me to get into that. He started speaking out against gangs in the 80s and 90s. He had been in prison for years at this point. Do I doubt that he truly wishes he had not started the Crips? I do. I can sense in his writings that he is very regretful of that, because the Crips took a mind of their own. And much like Larry Hoover, who has no control over what's going on in Chicago, he's been in prison so long, nobody knows who he is. Tookie had been in prison so long, he had no control over LA. Okay, he could say whatever he wanted in these books or through these videotapes that he was sending out, but nobody gave a shit. Most of these guys who were gang banging, Tookie was in prison before these guys were even born. All right, so that's one thing that kind of makes me raise my eyebrow. But then as I read this, because later he talks about having the Moto Indani, which he refers to as the fire within, because now he's in jail and he's reading. He's reading Chancellor Williams and Sheikh Anta Diop. Niggas go to prison and all of a sudden they just become Afrocentric. Now he's speaking Swahili. He takes a Swahili name. His Swahili name is Ajamu Nyamka Kamara. Ajamu means he who fights for what he wants. Nyamka means God's gift, and Kamara means he who teaches from experience. Two of his death row friends also take Swahili names that end with Kamara. So they created a group of guys with the last name Kamara, basically creating a family, because families all have the same name. So he basically creates a family on death row. And it's an interesting thing here because as I was reading this, I kept thinking to myself, this Barbara Beckno, it sounds like she's running the same game. And it immediately jumped in my head when I saw the movie. Because I forgot about the movie until I read about it in the book. And I was like, this is the same goddamn script that got Reuben Hurricane Carter out of prison. I love the movie Hurricane, right? It's the exact same goddamn thing. It's the same goddamn thing that saves Mumia Abu-Jamal. And I said, oh shit, I figured it out. And this is what makes me think this was all a sham. This whole Tookie is redeemed, all that. It follows the same script that all of these cases have followed. Black man ends up in prison, claims the prison is racist. Some people who don't know him come from the outside, claim that the system is racist and he didn't get a fair trial. They usually work for free because they're politically connected to try to get him freed from prison. And then all of these weird things start to occur. So now I don't know if Reuben Hurricane Carter was guilty or not. There was people who say he was guilty and that basically he managed to beat the case because of all of these outsiders from Canada who came and, you know, questioned all the evidence, you know, the old Innocence Project trick. I don't know if he was innocent or not. But they did the same thing with Mumia Abu-Jamal. Now, it was a big deal with Mumia because he was a Black Panther who was accused of murdering a police officer. I remember when I was in my woke stage, I used to listen to Mumia Abu-Jamal do these audio lectures live from death row. And there was like a collection of them that turned into a book. I don't have the book, but I used to listen to the old lectures. And it's basically just politics and current events and stuff like that to show that his mind is still sharp and, you know, give him an opportunity to speak to the world and all that sort of stuff. And the exact same thing happened. He was found guilty. You look at his trial transcripts and it's like, this is very bizarre behavior he's got here. He wants a guy who's a cult leader to be his lawyer, John Africa. He ended up losing the case basically because he was acting like a psychopath and wanted John Africa as a lawyer. John Africa is not a lawyer. John Africa is a cult leader. Okay? That's just one of the many problems with the Mumia Abu-Jamal case. But I'm not going to get into that. But he became the call celeb. And they managed to save Mumia's life. Mumia was on death row. They got his sentence commuted to life. Now he's still alive. He's like in his 80s or something like that. He's a very old guy now. And he's dying a slow, painful death in prison. It's just disastrous. But that's what made me start thinking, Hurricane Carter, they got him out. Mumia Abu-Jamal, they commuted his sentence. Now you're going to work on getting Tookie out, right? First they're saying, well, let's just get clemency, so he'll get life in prison. Let's get rid of the death sentences so he'll get life in prison. Once he's got life in prison, we can work on getting him out of prison, right? But the thing is, you stop when he's dead, right? So I started paying attention. And I realized that part of this all comes from the same pattern. These socialists / communists, these politically motivated people, they show up and start harassing a case that is 20 years old, 30 years old, or whatever. The witnesses are dead or sick or old and nobody can remember anything. And they start trying to poke holes in this case after decades. They're arguing about DNA and fingerprints and alibis and all this sort of stuff. Most of it is, you know, procedural shit and all that sort of stuff, right? And that's when I started saying, I'm not sure this was anything other than an attempt to save Tookie's life. He was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize because he wrote children's books. He did a couple of anti-gang speeches. He did some Q&As with kids about being anti-gang. That was all good. Nobody can say that was a bad thing. That was all very good stuff. But then they try to turn him into this model individual. And I'm thinking, they're going to make a movie about this guy? Now, his life is absolutely worth making a movie about. But the movie was all about humanizing him. And he never seen the movie, actually. As far as I know, he didn't see it. He wasn't allowed to see it. He's on death row. But he got to read the scripts and all that sort of stuff. But it was one of the things Barbara was working on. And Barbara brought Jesse Jackson to the prison the day before Tookie was executed to try to get Arnold Schwarzenegger to grant clemency, to commute his sentence. He was nominated for a Nobel Prize several times by random white people who he had never met. And their only way of defending this is that, well, other people who had won Nobel Prizes or were nominated for Nobel Prizes, they weren't great people either. They were trying to save this guy's life. All of this stuff, the movie, the book, all of this stuff was about trying to save his life. I'm not sure any of it was about redemption. He could have actually changed. But this feels like all this propaganda was put out there to try to save the guy's life. Not that I'm necessarily against it. He obviously wanted to live. He didn't want to die. But I'm not sure he was innocent of these crimes, mainly because he didn't really defend himself in the book. He didn't defend himself in court. He didn't testify. In the book, all he did was talk bad about the witnesses. He tried to discredit the witnesses in the book as being snitches and people who were forced into tattletelling and all this sort of stuff. It's not good enough. It's not good enough, okay? So if you want to know why I kind of question whether this Tookie thing is real, that's why. Because it's following the same exact playbook that you get with all these other Innocence Project cases. Oh, this is a poor black guy who got caught up in the system. He's got some Afrocentric name now. He's not a Muslim. He said it in the book that he's not a Muslim or a Christian or anything. So when he's talking about praying all the time, it's like, who do you pray to? He's praying to the one God, the creator. That's not the same. Everybody doesn't have the same God, man. Are you shooting with no target? Who are you praying to? And that was also very suspicious to me, is that he became spiritual without becoming religious. And he started taking up Swahili names. So now the whole Swahili name thing, I just make fun of it. It's not like it's a problem. A lot of people want to change who they are, and the first thing they do is change their name. You know, I guess it helps change your mentality. It helps change your life by changing your name. But I was very suspicious when I saw he took up a Swahili name. I was like, what? Get the fuck out of here. Because he doesn't use it. He doesn't use it at all in the book. See, when Malcolm X decided to change his name to Malcolm X, he used it everywhere. When Muhammad Ali changed his name to Muhammad Ali, to him, Cassius Clay was dead. He referred to himself as Muhammad Ali. He referred to himself as Tookie in this book. He never on the front of the book is not his African name, it's his own name. Stanley Tookie Williams. And Tookie is not a nickname, by the way. That's his actual goddamn name. All right. This is his nickname. So let's talk about, come on to close this out. Let's talk about my favorite chapter. This is the chapter that actually made this book for me, because I was reading through this book saying Tookie doesn't care about anything except being a Crip. All right. He doesn't really care about anything. He talks about relationships, but they're fleeting. He only just talks about having sex with random girls or random women sending him money or, pictures and stuff, but nothing really emotional. And near the end, he talks about Fred Hollowell, who I said is his stepfather, and how much he loved him. And that's one of the few times he mentioned that he loved somebody in this book. It fits the title, Blue Rage, right? That he's very mad with everybody and mad at everything. But Sons of the Father, page 38. This is where he talks about his two sons, Trayvon and Stan, who is Stanley Tookie Williams III, I think. All right. And his relationship with them. This is my favorite chapter in this book. So he says, because there are so many black fathers trapped within America's prison system, an entire nation could be grown from the roots of our abandoned children. Mass incarceration has become a divisive force that splits families and foments a son's resentment for his father. As a youth, I often felt emptiness in my life, and not simply for a lack of father's presence. My biological father was a sad example of fatherhood. I yearned for an esteemed black male figure who projected a dynamic image and could strive to emulate or to surpass. In different circumstances, my chances for success would have increased considerably. That's the opening passage of this chapter. And then he starts talking about his own children. He says, from the moment of Trayvon's birth on October 30th, 1973, I can count on two hands the times I was in his presence, and on one hand the times I held him in my arms before I was incarcerated 6 years later. And he talks about his son, Trayvon, his oldest son, coming to visit him with his mother, and them building a relationship over the years, and even Trayvon bringing his grandson to meet him. This was incredibly touching. This was wonderful. This is the redemption part of the redemption story. Is that he reconnected with these, he lived long enough to apologize and reconnect with his sons. But the thing that almost made me cry in public is his youngest son. So he has another son with a different woman. He says, young Stan, or he called it Little Tookie, his misfortune was trying to follow the path I had trod. Stan was an Imperial Court Crip and had christened himself Little Tookie. Older Crips who knew Stan and his attitude was reminiscent of me at that age. Trayvon had told me he met Stan only once. They hung out for a little while and then parted ways. Other than being fathered by me, they seemed to be from different worlds. Stan was out there cripping like his father and masking his frustration with intoxicants. Now, he mentions that his son goes to prison for manslaughter. And this is, again, one of the most touching elements of the book. This is absolutely fantastic. He says March 13th, 2002, he was woken up by his neighbor who was yelling that his son is calling him. So he looks downstairs and he sees his son Stan, who is in prison, where he is in prison. Okay? He has not seen his son since 1979. 23 years since he saw his son. And they meet in prison. And they hug. And he teaches his son all of these things that he's learned in prison. You know, how to build up his vocabulary, how to get yoked. And then he says, this expression of forgiveness was a huge boulder lifted off my shoulders. It was a cleansing that would allow me to reach out to the other sons and daughters of the world. It was atonement. When I tell you this is the craziest thing in the world. His son got arrested for manslaughter and was just passing through the prison. He was there for overnight. That was it. And Tookie in the book is just completely destroying the guards and calling them names and everything. But it was one of the guards that took him to his son, who he had not seen since 1979, and let them sit and talk. And I guess he was there for more than one day because they were together for a long time. And that's how the book ends. The book ends with young Stan and older Stan coming together and him apologizing to his son for not being in his life. He got an opportunity. He lived long enough. He lived long enough to be redeemed in the eyes of his sons. This is the most important part of the story. This is the most important part of the story. Out of all the crazy stuff that you see in this book, this is the real heart of it. Because he doesn't make a big deal out of his children existing in the early part of the book. He mentions them, but it's in passing. I saw my son playing on the floor while I was about to smoke or something like that. It was so jarring that if you read this thing, you don't even know when the kids were born. Like, I was still trying to figure out which one was the older one by the time we got to this part of the book. He makes no real mention of their mothers. He mentions their names, but he also says that he changes some names in the book. He said that earlier in the book, that for people's privacy and all that sort of stuff, he changes certain names. So maybe he didn't use their actual mother's names. But he doesn't really make a big deal out of being a father for the first time. He doesn't really make a big deal of being a father at all. His family actually starts becoming less and less important as the book goes on. He talks about his mom less, talks about his sister less. His sister basically disappears after the first couple of chapters. You don't know if his sister dead or alive. Step siblings, you don't know if they dead or alive. And you know, most of these people don't come see him either. They don't come visit. But his mom does still come visit. And she brought the son with him, and he was able to bond with his son over the prison phone. And then he's able to bond with his second son when his second son got sent to prison. So that was very important to me. And I believe that's the most important part of the book. That's the part of the book where I truly do believe that he was redeemed. That he learned from his mistakes. He talked about hating his own father for abandoning him. And that frustration led to so many of the other issues that he had. And he abandoned his own sons, but he lived long enough that he got to tell his sons he was sorry. That means everything to me, man. That was worth the cost of the book. It was very good. Very, very good. He doesn't give you a whole hell of a lot about the Crippen. It's actually quite quite obvious that it was, a whole lot of drugs and alcohol and product of his environment and all that. But his redemption with his sons was beautiful. It's an excellent note to end on. Now, Barbara Becknell, she goes into Tookie's execution. And I guess we're going to go to this. So Barbara Becknell says, Stan symbolized a trophy kill. He was the co-founder of the Crips gang. Tookie deserved to die. As many angry emails sent to him and to me stated, the writers of those messages did not care if Stan was in fact innocent of the crimes that put him on death row. They made him culpable for every criminal act committed by any gang member located anywhere in the United States. Stan became the symbolic black man as criminal stereotype. It says few people knew that Stan had never been to prison in his life prior to being sent to death row. Yes, and he talked about that in his book. He kept getting away with shit. He was doing stuff, but he was getting away with shit. It says, quote, others often rejoiced in his execution, considered his death a must-win. Those emails often linked him with O.J. Simpson, writing that we didn't get O.J., so we got to execute Tookie. That was how justice could best be symbolized for them. But the majority of emails were simply racist with no other pretense. This is obviously a black woman, I looked her up, and she's an old lady now. She's in her 70s. But she was like exactly what you would think. She's a socialist. I mean, it is what it is. She tells one of these stories that these racists sent her. I'm not going to read it because it uses the N-word, but matter of fact, yes, I will. Who cares? She says, why don't I run a nigger over with a bike? And then the answer says, because it's probably my kid's bike. What do you call a black president? Nigger. What would you call Tookie if he was alive? Or if he was a white, alive? Or whatever. Like all of these sorts of things that these are apparently emails that she was being sent. Now, the O.J. Simpson thing was kind of eye-opening. Now, a lot of you don't know this, but the jury who acquitted O.J. Simpson, a lot of them did it out of racial animosity, meaning that those people may have heard evidence that O.J. Simpson was guilty, but they were not going to find him guilty. They wanted revenge, quote unquote, for Rodney King. And now they're saying Tookie was executed out of revenge for O.J. Simpson. This is what Barbara Becknell was saying. There's a whole big logical leap to play. Now, there was a juror that you can find a juror for the O.J. Simpson case who shrugged when she was said when it said that they made the decision on O.J. based off race, and she shrugged. And he was an old black lady, and she was kind of like, "Oh well, we're not sending a brother to prison over and killing no white woman." And this is why they say all white juries are racist, because they believe that if you get black people on the jury, you're going to get away with it. This is what they learned. So she details Tookie's execution, which I will spare you the gritty details of it. But apparently they stopped using the lethal injection drugs because of its effect on Tookie, and how much pain he was probably in as he was being executed. Obviously, there's no conversation at all about the people who were murdered and whether their families were even present. Because usually they invite the families of the remaining family of the victim. But that is Blue Rage, Black Redemption, Stanley Tookie Williams. Took an hour and a half to get through this book. I like the book. I probably like Monster better. I'm gonna read Monster again. I have other things to read first, though. So thanks everybody for stopping by, man. It's almost 11 o'clock. I appreciate you guys for standing up this late. Talk to you guys later, man. Peace out.